Hi everyone, welcome to our presentation on atmospheric theatre, open air performance in the environment, which is an AHRC funded project that myself, Chloe Preedy, and my colleague Evelyn O'Malley have been running together over the last 2.5 years. We're going to be speaking to you about various aspects of this project. I'm going to start by talking about some of the overarching context and some of the research into literary texts that I've conducted that underpins some of the subsequent performance related research we've been doing, which Evelyn will talk about in a bit more detail when I hand over to her shortly. This project was our interest in this project was spurred by the fact that air pollution is an incredibly serious issue for everyone. Over the course of our lifetimes, the average person will breathe in 250 million litres of air. So we're incredibly dependent on the air that sustains us, but also incredibly dependent on its quality. Clean air is something that's important to all of us. Now, to some degree, the coronavirus pandemic has been making us more aware of the quality of the air around us. Debates about, for instance, the difference between droplet transmission and aerosol particle transmission have been in the news. People have been thinking about masks, about the aerial environments that we share with others. But actually, I was recently searching Google Trends to see how much interest in air pollution had spiked as a result. And air pollution itself has not received as strong a leap from this particular focus as I initially had expected might be the case. It seems as though the very fact that the air is invisible and only sometimes perceptible to our senses makes it still quite easy for us to overlook the air as such, as opposed to more perceptible things that might be moving through it. And that's a problem because air pollution, as this World Health Organization graphic makes clear, remains an incredibly serious and deadly threat to global health across the world. Around 7 million deaths globally are attributed to air pollution in one form or another. Now, partly this is a question of geographical unfairness to some degree, something that we should be aware of for that reason, because as you'll see from this particular map, it's significantly different depending on what part of the world you live in, how far you are impacted by this issue. But it's something that everyone should also be aware of, because in every part of the world, air pollution remains an issue. And a Public Health England report, for instance, noted that air pollution is the biggest environmental threat to health within the UK. Now, these issues are particularly interesting to me as an early modernist, someone who works on the drama of Shakespeare and his contemporaries, because the 16th century, the latter part of it, is really one of the first times that people started within Europe and particularly within England, drawing attention to the question of air quality as an issue. As this particular graphic by Peter Grimblecombe and Carlota Grossi illustrates, sulphur dioxide levels were rising rapidly within early modern England. So too were other forms of pollution, including particulate pollution levels. And this was largely linked to a kind of urban expansion and an emerging industrialised use of coal. So the kind of industrial pollution elements that we are still living with today were starting to become a factor within early modern experiences of air quality. And writers at the time were starting also to reflect on the medical implications. Robert Burton, a 16th, 17th century physician, wrote about the way in which a clean air cheers up the spirits, exhilarates the mind, whereas he argued that a thick, black, misty air might overthrow the mind, and argues that great heed is therefore to be taken how we let in or exclude this ambient air. Now, Burton wasn't thinking about the threats to the health of air pollution in perhaps quite the same way as most medical authorities would today. But nonetheless, this convergence of themes is interesting to me, especially because it also simultaneously overlaps with the emergence of the professional theatre within England, and indeed the building of these theatres and more generally a kind of European trend as it continued. Because what was happening at the time was that most of the theatres that were being built within this expanding and polluted London were open-air venues, therefore venues that were simultaneously exposed to the air, but also partially enclosed as well, providing an interesting liminal space within which writers and performers and audience members might reflect on the quality of the air that they shared and experienced. So this research that I'm going to talk about now relates to my book project. I have a forthcoming monograph on this, Theatres of the Air. And as for this particular monograph project, I focused on 102 plays that could be associated primarily or exclusively with performance at open-air venues, representing work by, among other authors, Thomas Heywood, Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, and William Shakespeare. And this this sort of literary research identified several key trends within the drama of the time, several key ways in which people evoked or thought about the air. The first was similar to that which we've already seen within Burton's work, where Shakespeare within A Midsummer Night's Dream kind of encapsulates this trend, where people thought about the way in which the air fuels the operation of the mind, the imagination. That is, the air we breathe in powers our brains and our fantasies. But Shakespeare also inverted this, thinking about the way in which the theatre then made these imaginary thoughts manifest. People experienced them through the air. And so imagination, the poet's pen, gave to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Other writers evoked fictional air quality and fictional aerial experiences. So in the play Pericles, for instance, we have characters engaging in an exchange about the direction of the wind that blows, in a way that invites audience members to think about fictional winds, but also perhaps real winds, and the way in which they disturb or impact on our aerial experience. Other playwrights thought about the way in which the air might become a resource, both in the literal sense of powering windmills or driving sail-powered vessels across the seas, but also in the fantastical sense of allowing people to fly. Thomas Dekker's Fortunatus, for instance, features a character who describes how he is cut through the air like a falcon, flying from Babylon to Famagosta in Cyprus. And finally, we get ways in which, building on this particular trend of perhaps occasionally literally stage in flight episodes, playwrights and players thought about how they might alter the literal and material atmosphere of the playhouses in which they were performing. Ben Jonson wrote this episode, for instance, in which a fictional scene of the perfuming of a fictional interior household also has a literal impact on the theatre environment, as incense is burnt in censers and flowers are strewn on stage. And that sensory impact is something that Christopher Marlowe also thought about in his War Drama Cymbeline, thinking about how the use of guns during this performance would produce a smoke that transformed both the fictional and the atmospheric air of the theatre into this polluted environment, evocative of hell. Singe these black plains, his protagonist suggests, and make them seem as black as is the island where the Furies mask. Lines that register the material impact of air pollution on the theatre fabric, but that also draw figurative comparisons between the fictional experience of this pollution and a kind of air pollution conquest. Now, our project was interested in how these literary traces of air pollution and aerial experience might then translate into contemporary performance when people staged plays like this. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Evelyn to talk in more detail about this aspect.
Thanks, Chloe. So as Chloe has explained, I am leading on the contemporary performance part of this project, working with our partner organisations, Minack Theatre in Cornwall, the Willow Globe in the middle of Wales, and Duke's Theatre in Lancaster, where we're conducting audience research, carrying out focus groups with young audiences, and undertaking workshops with young theatre makers, and conducting archival work in these spaces. While audience members may not immediately think about the references to air from the early modern period that Chloe has just highlighted, they are embedded in air and engaging in it in a way that ignites certain relationships between the fictitious and the actual air in the imagination. So the research for this strand of atmospheric theatres is underpinned by ethnographic and historical work on weathering Shakespeare, looking at audiences and open-air performance, tracking them through history from the pastoral players in late Victorian England. These are the pastoral players, founded by Eleanor Calhoun and Lady Archibald Campbell in Surrey, where audience participation in the work was to retreat from a stuffy, polluted London and to the countryside, and then to return enlightened to the city, through what becomes a performance of not pastoral but of weathering in the context of contemporary climate change activism. So this is BP or not BP's ultimately successful festival protesting fossil fuel sponsorship at the RSC. Participatory audience work here in the open air that many of you may be familiar with. So across history, we can identify cultural performances of weathering in the sense of a repertoire of gestural and discursive responses from audience members that reflect and are implicated in the cultural responses to environmental change. Some of them environmentally progressive and some of them less so, a bit more dubious. So over the past year, these practices have again shifted in significance as the experience transitions from one of togetherness and community, contemplating ways to try and sustain this community, when we are now aware of COVID-19 having contaminated impacted the air beyond the pollutants and weather changes that we were already concerned with in this project, whereby open air performance and the open air in general has been touted as safer than other forms of theatre and experience of being together. So while this has necessitated already new modes of co-presence for audiences, and while our partners are very much at the fore of undertaking this work, we can expect the coming months to reveal more ingenuity and innovation in terms of weathering as an audience practice that is related to the air. So we might look to audiences for performance in the open air as already participating in an ethical response to weathering together within a changing and endangered environment. So that just leaves me to finish with the outputs for this project that are already available and may be of interest. We have a map of venues and spaces that are used for open air performance across the UK that may be of interest to practitioners. Likewise, we've created a range of educational resources for secondary school or high school students that engage with air pollution and have practical tasks in there too. And we'll have a special issue of Performance Research Journal on Air coming out soon. So thank you very much for your time.
I'd like to begin talking about my Eco-Shakespeare performance project, Cymbeline in the Anthropocene, by starting with an epigram from Christopher Schauberg's Searching for the Anthropocene. Inspired by Bruno Latour's metaphor of circling the planet, quote, looking for a new place to land, unquote, in a world we have ubiquitously damaged, Schauberg identifies airports and airportness, ironically, as the leading sites and symptoms of our new Anthropocene homelessness. It's now an especially melancholy displacement because airports remain largely off limits during the COVID-19 crisis. But these conditions are also invitations to recover an authentic and sustainable sense of local placefulness and global belonging. Schauberg defines that challenge in these terms. The Anthropocene is always as much of a social provocation as it is a scientific paradigm. It's a call to responsibility, to acceptance, and to taking action, however small an individual action may seem in the vast collective species-sized dilemma that such a shift also entails. Each interaction opens up possibilities for a new orientation. Cymbeline in the Anthropocene takes action by mobilizing Shakespeare's reputation as the world's best-known playwright in order to tell new stories about our era's traumas of progress and hopes for survival. Its reorientations consist of creative adaptations of the playwright's late tragicomic romance in site-specific productions on 5 continents. Bringing together the power of Shakespeare in performance and local eco-dramaturgy not only creates new public narratives about living in the world we have deformed, but also reshapes Shakespeare's cultural image as a playwright who speaks to today's contemporary fears of human and non-human extinctions. Theatre companies on 5 continents are graciously contributing production materials and video performances to a research website and archive supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Each collaborating company is recreating the play's stories and terrains to reflect regional environmental histories and conflicts. In all cases, the goal is to use community performances of Cymbeline to open actors' and audiences' imaginations at home and abroad to today's pressing bioglobal concerns. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has delayed all our scheduled performances until this year. But by the time you listen to this talk, the first ones will have debuted in Melbourne, Australia, live, indoors, and in person, and in Yosemite, Merced, California, in a feature film, shot on location in both places. Please visit our website for videos and blogs about these and other collaborating productions into 2022. Why choose Cymbeline for such a project? The short answer is the play's huge potential for theatrical reinvention. Cymbeline's relative unfamiliarity means it carries less traditional baggage and is verbally, visually, and musically adaptable in modern performance. It's also packed with stories and themes that readily analogize today's climate change and COVID-19 crises, such as human greed and cruelty, personal risk and resilience, co-evolved dwelling and being, accountability and forgiveness. The range of its locales, cities, rivers, forests, harbors, mountains, makes it attractively open to topographic invention. Its characters experience this spatial diversity in sometimes hostile, sometimes welcoming ways. And this too speaks to the unsettling physical and existential impacts of today's environmental volatility. In generic terms, Cymbeline's tragic comedy juxtaposes scenes of intense grief and joy, disgust and eroticism, weirdness and queerness. The mental and emotional agility required of both actors and spectators to negotiate these reversible and non-linear shifts suggests behavioral strategies we are all discovering in order to live through the Anthropocene's uncontrollable threats. This includes heightened concern for exploited people and animals, forced into the precarity of what late environmental philosopher Val Plumwood calls the world's trashed and abandoned shadow places. The speculative and supernatural elements of Cymbeline's romance narrative, personified by its revenants, gods, and soothsayer, also offer mimetic opportunities to represent today's non-analog and anti-metaphorical crises that accurately capture the Anthropocene's resistance to purely rational explanations or predictions. Most importantly, perhaps, Cymbeline invites us to acknowledge collective responsibility for narcissistic exploitation of human and non-human others. It asks us to forgive the dickheads, as we delicately called them at our pre-COVID planning meeting. And it inspires us to, quote, live and deal with others better. That includes non-white, non-metropolitan, and non-binary others. The extravagance of Cymbeline's fictions has long been an object of critical ridicule. But in the 21st century, what Dr. Johnson called the play's imbecilities seems strangely apt for the emerging new normal of the Anthropocene's seemingly impossible causes and effects. Appreciation for this human-altered state of naturalism shatters dreams of pastoral homeostasis associated with older Romantic and green Shakespeares. The play's twists, turns, and revelations propel its characters into new forms of multi-temporal consciousness and interspecies subjectivity, which the Anthropocene's bizarre ruptures and intimacies are also reshaping. Take, for example, the time-twisting moment when the predatory Renaissance Machiavel Giacomo, hiding in a treasure chest brought from imperial Rome, emerges in a bedchamber furnished with classical books and cosmopolitan ornaments of early modern globalization, situated in provincial ancient Britain, to violate a fairy tale princess and devour her reputation. Because the play's plots are drawn from folk tales and romance fiction, the Wicked Stepmother and the long-lost prince's narratives, for instance, they connect transculture with non-English-speaking traditions. Cloten's English colonial arrogance towards inhabitants of rural Wales also suggests indigenous European experiences of first contacts, while Inigen's apparently territorially induced sickness creates a reversed reflection of the West's devastating bio-impacts on non-European life forms. Eco-appropriations of Cymbeline in the Anthropocene will bear witness to the recognition that whoever controls today's cultural narratives about the new era of human planetary domination will also determine the Earth's destinies, and perhaps the futures of our solar neighbors, for better or worse. Thinking further in structural terms, the mashed-up paradoxes and ironies of Cymbeline's plot lines seem perfect for getting our heads around today's seemingly far-fetched disasters, like ice storms in Texas or pandemics from pangolins. Theatrical adaptations which layer allusions to or images of such experiences usefully decenter the supposed exceptionalism of human consciousness. In Cymbeline, animal outsides become human insides, and human flesh morphs into animal selfhood. After the racist bully Cloten provokes Guiderius into beheading him, happy river fishes feast on Welsh rarebit. Several new engagements with the project are already extending its imaginative and activist possibilities. Among senior undergrads in English at the University of California, Merced, Amber Loper's brilliant avian adaptation of the play, and Serena Johnson and Sierra McCormack's haunting musical reflection of Fideli's burial song reflect the creative posthumanism of a new generation of eco-artists. Hilary Eklund's first years at Loyola University, New Orleans, have reinvented Cymbeline's characters through musical playlists and pop art. Evelyn O'Malley's students at the University of Exeter have remapped the play towards a post-lockdown production in their stunningly beautiful Cymbeline. The weekly blogs on our website have been showcasing these co-creations, as well as tracking the progress of our main contributing companies in imaginatively related productions, such as Gretchen Minton's Timon of Anaconda, which you will hear about directly after my talk. To adapt a metaphor from media ecologist Alenda Chang, our project is trying to create a kind of theatrical game screen through which we can interact and transform and not just reflect Anthropocene impacts in small, localized, but globally networked ways. We invite other teachers, students, scholars, and practitioners to participate in these playfully serious exchanges. In the brief time remaining, I'd like to focus on just one particular eco-orientation in Cymbeline: bottom-up critique of the emergent ethos of maximizing the profitable exploitation of material resources and human labor. In her book, Hope and Grief in the Anthropocene, Australian geographer Leslie Head shows how community-centered remedial practices can redress the grief and anger which haunt the Anthropocene's threats to modern progress and the environmental and racial carnage which has sustained that fantasy. Cymbeline represents this kinds of grassroots resistance in ways that may reframe how we think about oppressive subjectivities in the Anthropocene. When the play opens, everyone except the king, his queen, and Cloten is feeling demoralized by the court's injustice towards Posthumus and Imogen and its indifference to the well-being of the country, later falsely dressed up as the emancipatory myths of a post-continental Britain. But lower rank or marginalized individuals have the courage to act what they feel and know is right. Cornelius undermines the queen's attempt to turn her deadly animal poisons on Imogen. Courtier lords amusingly contain and divert Cloten's unsavory violence. Imogen may be a princess, but her tyrannical and ecologically myopic father abuses her like a caged animal. Her empathetic servant Pisanio becomes one of several minor heroes in the play by abetting Imogen's escape in disguise, aiding her on the grueling exile into Wales, and imagining transnational solidarity with the conscientious Roman ambassador, Lucius. By sending Posthumus a benignly deceptive bloody cloth, Pisanio not only disrupts and shames Posthumus's revenge plans, but also sparks incipient self-critique of his destructive misogyny, which the play tropes as male violence towards feminized nature generally, through Imogen's association with birds and other non-human animals. Malarius is socially above Pisanio in rank, but like Imogen, he also suffers court slander and exile. He survives these misfortunes by living close to the land in rural Wales and teaching the king's two sons human-animal codependence in the hope of eventually subverting Cymbeline's brittle patriarchal tyranny. These are essential skills of risk and resilience as Anthropocene calamities intensify while governments continue to bow to the interests of the greedy and the powerful. The universalism which Cymbeline finally celebrates is not that of Caesar, the universal landlord in Antony and Cleopatra, but of globally responsible localism. Our project's first two collaborating productions in Australia and California are conceptually and materially invested in this vernacular ethos, as are other contributors to the project. They are showing that hope can emerge from environmentally traumatized lives and places, and that eco-theater can move us to repair local habitats to enable all forms of life to flourish. The self-consciousness of Cymbeline's dramatic storytelling invites eco-critical and dramaturgical recreation by student and community practitioners who, so far, have been in the vanguard of reframing Shakespearean performance in terms of new Anthropocene perspectives. Thank you very much.
My name is Gretchen Minton, and I'm from Montana State University, Bozeman, Montana, USA. In recent decades, actors playing the title role in Timon of Athens have spent much of the second half of the play standing knee or waist deep in a pit, so often, in fact, that the character begins to look like an angry version of Hamlet's gravedigger. This staging seems appropriate, for Timon has dug his own grave in a metaphorical sense, behaving in a financially irresponsible manner and misjudging everyone around him. On a more literal level, his frantic digging for food turns into a desire to seek death through a return to Mother Earth. Ultimately, such digging taps into the fantasy of connection to nature, even as it acknowledges the fact that our tendency to dig is a fundamentally destructive act that bears the indelible mark of the Anthropocene. In 2019, I adapted Timon of Athens, setting it in Montana in the northern U.S. Rockies. This adaptation, entitled Timon of Anaconda, foregrounds the links between economic and ecological systems in Montana, a state that was first settled by white people because of gold mining, built into an economic powerhouse because of copper mining, and continues to be one of the top coal producers in the U.S. The Timon of Anaconda adaptation sought to revitalize and reclaim the early modern text, the performance sites, and the community ethos of environmental stewardship. The city of Butte in southwest Montana was dubbed the richest hill on earth in the late 19th century because of its immense deposits of ore. After decades of digging tunnels to excavate the copper and other minerals, the powerful Anaconda Mining Company turned to open-pit mining in the mid-1950s. When the resources of Butte proved less lucrative, Anaconda shut down that mine, leaving a giant chasm in what was once the richest hill on Earth. The Berkeley Pit measures 7,000 feet in length by 5,600 feet in width. When the mining operation was discontinued, the pump stopped running, and subsequently the pit filled with groundwater and rain that created a highly toxic lake, laden with arsenic, zinc, and sulfuric acid at a depth of 1,780 feet. The pit, along with the stretch of Deer Lodge Valley in which Butte is located, is the largest EPA Superfund site in the U.S. The sobering fact is that no one knows how to clean up the damage, and soon the pit's water is predicted to contaminate Silver Bow Creek, and thus the entire water table, a process accelerated by rising temperatures due to climate change. Meanwhile, the impact of the toxins on wildlife is startlingly apparent. Several times, flocks of snow geese have landed on this artificial lake and died, their white feathers stained by the red-orange acidic liquid that they mistook for life-sustaining water. The boom and bust economy of Butte, as well as its record of environmental catastrophe, have made it the subject of much attention. It is all too easy to point fingers at Butte and to use this place as an object lesson about human errors. But such narratives are oversimplified and ultimately unhelpful when considering the effectiveness of environmentally inflected theater for making a difference in our world. A similar point is made by Timothy LeCain in his book Mass Destruction, which offers an instructive look at Butte's history from an environmental, technological point of view. He argues that we should resist a too facile framing of Butte's environmental history as merely a morality play on the evils of early 20th century corporate capitalism, because such a simple declensionist tale tends to obscure other important aspects of the story that offer more useful lessons for understanding the human relationship to the environment. As a resident of Montana, I find myself drawn to Butte's story. Thus, I seek ways to talk about its past and potential futures. Like many others, I believe in employing Shakespearean texts to negotiate the myriad issues facing us today, and my foremost concern is the environment. The excavation of a Shakespearean text to talk about the excavation of the earth in Montana offers a provocative synergy for Shakespearean adaptation. My aims are rooted in the practice of eco-dramaturgy, an important ethical movement that calls for more environmentally conscious theatrical practices. In the words of Theresa May, eco-dramaturgy puts ecological reciprocity at the center of its theatrical and thematic intent, thereby seeking to break down the binaries between nature and culture, hope and despair, the individual and the community. Timon of Anaconda is set in the period roughly from the late 1960s to the early 1980s. The scale of open-pit mining changed everything in Butte, most significantly the pace of environmental impact and the rate at which the neighborhoods were destroyed to accommodate an ever-increasing area for mining. This adaptation does not merely replay the horrors of the past, however, but instead seeks to articulate the network of human and non-human systems that both created and have been impacted by this history. In this adaptation of the Shakespeare Middleton play, Timon is reimagined as a mining mogul from the Anaconda Copper Company. Timon begins with the naive belief that all segments of Butte's society are fundamentally connected in positive ways. But in the wake of his financial destruction and his friends' refusal to help him, he attempts to sever human connection by retreating to the wilderness outside of Butte. Yet the more Timon seeks to isolate himself, the more he realizes that he cannot extract himself from human networks that mercilessly exploit the earth. He still uses the tools of civilization. His spade and pickaxe aid his desperate digging of roots, and the gold that he unearths comes in the form of green-tinted rocks, suggesting the copper veins of mineral-rich earth. The military general Alcibiades in the original became a mining foreman in Timon of Anaconda. Alcibiades' loyalties clearly lie with Butte's rank-and-file miners. However, he is too short-sighted to see that the environment created by unbridled capitalism and exploitation of natural resources will shortly cause the collapse of Butte's economic and ecological systems. The cynic Apemantus in Timon of Athens is an outspoken critic of flattery and hypocrisy, and this main character trait is carried over into the adaptation, where Apemantus is envisioned as a Montana woodsman who spends most of his time living off the land as if he were an old-time mountain man. His desire to live in accordance with nature seems commendable at the outset of the performance, but his rants are suggestive of self-righteous environmentalism. Along with the other servant characters, the Stewart represents the central possibility of hope in Timon of Anaconda. This character was modeled upon Rachel Carson, and she is, in every sense of the word, a steward, taking care of both human and non-human environments. Not only does the steward portray a genuine concern for her master throughout, but she has the greatest ecological sensibility, offering not money but food, not flattery but empathy. Timon of Athens is a suggestive text for ecological adaptation for many reasons, not the least of which is the insistent language about the non-human world. Timon's speeches abound with references to worms, toads, wolves, and all manner of beasts, but especially dogs. Inspired by this suggestion, I learned more about a famous stray dog that lived for nearly 17 years around the Berkeley pit, with hideously dreadlocked fur and heightened levels of arsenic in his system. Called the Auditor, this misshapen canine has become a sort of mascot of Butte, an emblem of environmental degradation, but also a testimony that it is possible to endure. In our production, the dog belongs first to Apemantus, then lives with Timon in the wilderness, and finally survives as a reminder of the toxins that we all carry within us. The fundamental aim of the stage production was to immerse the story in particular outdoor locations that were not natural so much as post-industrial, thereby highlighting our position in the Anthropocene. The performance at Butte took place at the Foreman's Park at Mountain Con Mine Yard. The landmark mining headframe here bears the slogan, "Mile High, Mile Deep," a testimony to the mine that ran here for 60 years and then was abandoned for another 30 before being opened as a remediated public park in 2012. From this site, one can see the Berkeley pit, dozens of headframes, historic uptown Butte, and the rich lands on which these human structures have been built. When the play refers to the opulence of Butte, the actors were able to gesture toward the early 20th century homes of its heyday, many of which still stand in the historic district. More striking was the expansive presence, impossible to ignore, of the Berkeley Pit. In many ways, this pit seems like a graveyard, a chasm of death, a reminder of a forgotten past. Not far from Foreman's Park, however, excavators are still running, belying the common belief that just because the Berkeley Pit no longer operates, the mining industry is defunct. More hopefully, like Timon of Anaconda as an artistic work, this Butte Park is a site of mining reclamation. It provides a place for public gatherings amongst walking and biking trails through newly planted native grasses, while also maintaining interpretive signs that educate visitors about the complex legacy of this region. The Bozeman performance of Timon of Anaconda took place at the dilapidated Story Mill silos and was therefore further removed from the adaptation's language in terms of direct Butte references. But this post-industrial site nevertheless allowed for evocative connections to related histories. The Story Mill grain terminal was constructed in 1882. It was the largest elevator in Montana at that time and was a powerful economic force in the region. The Story Mill ceased operating in the late 1960s, but it remains an iconic structure in northeast Bozeman. The city has recently opened the large Story Mill Park next to these silos, dedicated to the revitalization of the industrial site for use by the community, along with the restoration of wetlands to enhance the animal population. Both sites evoked the material reminders of the many factors involved in telling an environmental history, echoing the adaptation's concern with the human and non-human costs of industrialization, but also the possibilities of restoration and stewardship. Timon of Anaconda's protagonist dies off stage as he does in the original, after carving his own misanthropic epitaph. But when the steward announces Timon's death and hands the epitaph to Alcibiades, written on a piece of tree bark, the foreman does not show any great interest in Timon's passing. He glances at the epitaph, but then distractedly discards it and returns to the city. In this devastated landscape, the steward reflects upon the horrible resting place for her master, gesturing toward the Berkeley Pit when saying, "Dead then, and this his grave." She picks up the epitaph again and delivers the final speech of the play, which evokes a sense of mourning that extends from the ruined miner to the prospective catastrophe that threatens the CPA site. Though he abhorred in us our human griefs, scorned our brains' flow, and those our droplets which from frugal nature fall, yet rich conceit taught him to make the rising water weep on his low grave, on faults forgiven. This speech suggests an agency in nature which is able to rebuke, yet mourn for, and ultimately reclaim the humans who have injured it. The script's reference to rising water evokes the continued and increasing problem of the sludge that cannot be held back by the dams indefinitely. This imagery also globalizes this local catastrophe, thereby making Timon an Anthropocene everyman, in a pit of his own making as the waters rise around him. After delivering this speech, the steward was joined by two of Timon's former servants, who hugged her in a spirit of sorrow and loss. She signals to these young people that they must now clean up the wreckage. Dead geese props had been preset, in a clear allusion to the multiple incidents of snow geese dying when they landed on the pit's acidic water. But there was also garbage on the ground. Some was preset, but other items turned out to be a byproduct of the audience that came to watch a performance in an outdoor location. The servant gathered some pieces of trash along with the geese, then returned to the steward. At that moment, the dog came on stage alone. When the steward and other servants reached out to touch the haggard animal, they accepted the offspring of the Anthropocene as part of moving toward a sustainable future.
This ending was not meant to be naively redemptive, but to assert that we all contain the toxic byproducts of mining, and thus all share in the poison, but also in the solutions. The steward and his fellow servants were poised to consider a new way of operating in the world, one that takes full measure of the earth and resists destructive anthropocentrism. By ending with the steward and this tone, Timon of Anaconda acknowledges the shared guilt of Butte's past, but also gestures toward potential futures that require forgiving faults, even egregious ones that create environmental catastrophe. With ecological systems of thought that are grounded upon reclamation, perhaps we can stop the obsessive practice of digging our own graves.